The wind howled across the Wyoming plains, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the promise of a storm. In the dim glow of a lantern, Clara Hensley stood trembling in her wedding dress, her heart pounding louder than the thunder rolling in the distance. Barely 19, her pale hands clutched the edge of a rough-hewn table in a one-room cabin, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and defiance. Across from her, Jack Ramsey, her new husband, froze mid-step, his weathered face etched with confusion at her words. "Give me the full 11 inches, she had said, her voice quivering but resolute, pointing to the gleaming Colt revolver on his belt. The room seemed to shrink around them, the weight of her request hanging like smoke in the air. This was no ordinary wedding night, and Clara was no ordinary bride. Her words were not a jest or a misunderstanding, they were a desperate plea born from a secret she had carried across the endless prairie, a secret that could either save her or destroy everything she had left. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the courage to face impossible odds, please hit that like button, drop a comment, share this story with someone who needs it, and subscribe to Gentle Hearts for more tales of hope and redemption. Your support keeps these stories alive." Clara's journey to this moment had begun months earlier, in a small Missouri town where the world had seemed both too big and too small. Born to a seamstress mother and a father who vanished before she could remember his face, Clara had grown up stitching dreams into scraps of fabric, her nimble fingers creating beauty from nothing. But beauty wasn't enough to shield her from the cruelty of men like Amos Tate, the town's wealthiest merchant, who had decided Clara's future long before she had a say. At 17, Amos had cornered her in his store, his breath sour with whiskey, promising her a life of comfort if she'd be his. When she refused, his promises turned to threats, and soon the town whispered of her ruin, lies spun by Amos to trap her. By 18, Clara's mother was dead, her savings stolen by Amos's cunning, and the only escape was a mail-order bride advertisement promising a new life in Wyoming. Jack Ramsey's letter had been brief but kind, describing a ranch in need of a woman's touch and a heart open to a quiet life. Clara had boarded the stagecoach with nothing but a satchel, her mother's thimble, and a vow to never let a man like Amos break her again. The journey west had been grueling, the stagecoach rattling over rutted trails, the other passengers eyeing her with pity or curiosity. Clara's delicate frame belied her strength, but the endless miles wore at her resolve. She had imagined Jack as a gentle giant, his words painting him as a man hardened by the land but softened by loss. He had written of a wife who died in childbirth, a son buried beside her, and a ranch that felt emptier each year. Clara clung to those words, hoping they promised safety. But when she stepped off the stagecoach in Laramie, Jack's weathered face and calloused hands told a different story. He was a man of few words, his eyes shadowed by grief, and the 11-inch Colt revolver at his hip gleamed like a warning. The wedding was a simple affair, a preacher muttering vows under a sky heavy with clouds, and by nightfall, they were alone in his cabin, the weight of their new bond pressing against the silence. Clara's request for the gun had not come lightly. It was born from a terror that had followed her like a shadow. Amos Tate, unwilling to let her go, had sent word through a hired man who shadowed the stagecoach, his leering face appearing at a waystation window one moonless night. "You'll never be free," he had whispered through the glass, his words carving fear into her bones. Clara knew Amos was not a man to make idle threats. He had the money to chase her, the cruelty to destroy her, and the arrogance to believe she belonged to him. She had kept her secret through the wedding, hoping distance would protect her, but the hoofbeats she heard in the distance as the preacher spoke told her otherwise. Amos was coming, and she would not be a lamb led to slaughter. The Colt, with its 11-inch barrel, was her only chance to stand her ground, to protect the fragile hope she had carried west. Jack, however, saw only a trembling girl in a wedding dress, her eyes wild with a fear he couldn't fathom. He had married her out of duty, not love, hoping a wife might fill the silence left by his losses. But Clara's demand for his gun stirred something deeper, a memory of his own failures, of a wife he couldn't save, of a son whose cries still haunted his dreams. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the revolver, unsure if he could trust this stranger who was now his wife. The cabin felt like a tinderbox, every creak of the floorboards amplifying the tension. Outside, the storm grew closer, lightning flashing through the single window, casting Clara's face in sharp relief. She was beautiful, yes, but it was her resolve that struck him, a fire that burned through her fear. He wanted to ask why, to demand her story, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he unbuckled the holster and set the Colt on the table, its weight thudding against the wood. "You know how to use it?" he asked, his voice low. Clara nodded, her fingers brushing the cold metal, and in that moment, Jack saw not a bride, but a survivor. The days that followed were a delicate dance of trust and suspicion. Clara learned the rhythms of the ranch, mending fences, tending the few cattle Jack had left, cooking meals in a kitchen that felt foreign. Jack watched her closely, noting how her hands shook when she thought he wasn't looking, how her eyes darted to the horizon at every strange sound. He began to teach her the land, showing her the hidden trails where a man could approach unseen, the places where the wind carried sounds of danger. Clara absorbed it all, her fear sharpening her senses. She practiced with the Colt in secret, her shots echoing across the empty plains, each pull of the trigger a defiance of the life she'd fled. But the ranch was no fortress, and Jack's own past weighed heavy. He had enemies of his own, rustlers who had stolen his herd, a rival rancher who coveted his land, and a town that saw him as a broken man. Clara's arrival had stirred whispers, and Jack feared her presence might draw trouble he couldn't handle. The first sign of Amos came on a frostbitten morning, when Clara found a scrap of fabric tied to a fence post, embroidered with her mother's pattern, a message only Amos could have left. Her heart seized, but she hid it from Jack, burning the fabric in the stove before he could see. She doubled her practice with the Colt, her shots growing steadier, her resolve hardening. Jack noticed the change, the way her softness gave way to steel, and it both awed and unsettled him. He began to share his own scars, telling her of the rustlers who had nearly ruined him, of the fever that took his first wife, of the guilt that kept him awake. Clara listened, her own secrets loosening, and one night, as they sat by the fire, she told him of Amos, of the threats, of the man who would never let her go. Jack's face darkened, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he took her hand, his grip rough but warm, and promised to stand with her. The storm broke on a night when the sky seemed to crack open, rain lashing the cabin as hoofbeats thundered closer. Amos had come, not alone, but with 2 hired guns, their silhouettes looming. Through the downpour, Clara's heart raced, but she stood at the window, the Colt steady in her hands. Jack was at her side, his own rifle raised, his grief replaced by a fierce need to protect. The confrontation was swift and brutal, words gave way to gunfire, the cabin's walls splintering under the assault. Clara's first shot missed, but her second found its mark, Amos clutching his shoulder as he fell. Jack's rifle drove the others back, their retreat swallowed by the storm. When the smoke cleared, Clara was shaking, the Colt still warm in her hands, but she was alive. Jack looked at her, not as a bride or a stranger, but as a partner, their bond forged in the fire of that night. In the weeks that followed, the ranch felt different. The town's whispers turned to respect, the rustlers kept their distance, and Clara's fear began to fade. She and Jack rebuilt, not just the cabin's walls, but the trust between them. Clara planted a small garden, her mother's thimble tucked in her pocket, a reminder of where she'd come from and what she'd survived. Jack began to smile, his grief softening under Clara's quiet strength. They were not in love, not yet, but they were something stronger, two souls who had chosen to fight for each other, against the odds, against the past. The Colt, now cleaned and returned to Jack's belt, was no longer just a weapon, but a symbol of their shared courage. As the Wyoming sun set over the plains, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Clara stood at the edge of the ranch, her eyes no longer scanning for danger but dreaming of a future she could build. She had come west seeking escape, but found something greater, a home, a purpose, and a man who saw her not as a prize, but as a force. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush, and for the first time, Clara felt free. If this story of courage, redemption, and the power of standing together touched your heart, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs a spark of hope, and subscribe to Gentle Hearts. Your support means the world to us, and we'd love to hear how this story moved you. Drop a comment below and let us know what touched you most. Before we end, we have a special request. Please leave a comment sharing a moment in your life when you found courage in the face of fear. Your stories inspire us all.